Sherlock Holmes and the Vanishing Killer, from the Reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., by Arthur Conan Doyle, in style. Chapter 1. The Murder in Broad Daylight. It was a damp, gray morning in London, the sort of weather that caused a pervasive chill to creep into one's bones. The fog rolled thick through the streets, shrouding the city's ever-bustling thoroughfares in a blanket of silence. A pall hung over the metropolis, muffling the clattering of carriages and the hum of street vendors who were going about their business, unconcerned by the gloom above them. In our quiet sitting room at 221B Baker Street, I was seated by the hearth with a medical treatise in hand, attempting to concentrate on a particularly difficult passage about the treatment of infectious diseases. Yet, as I had grown accustomed to, my attention was repeatedly diverted by the small, almost imperceptible sounds of Sherlock Holmes's activity in the adjoining room. His violin, ever his companion, had fallen silent some time ago, and now his keen senses appeared to be absorbing every detail within the walls of our flat. It was then that the sharp knock on the door broke the stillness, cutting through the silence like a dagger. Without hesitation, Holmes sprang from his chair, his movements fluid and deliberate, like a predator ready to pounce. I glanced up from my reading to find him already crossing the room, his face a mask of intrigue. A young boy stood in the doorway, pale and disheveled, his eyes wide with anxiety. "Mr. Holmes?" the lad stammered. "There's an urgent matter, sir. A murder, and the police request your presence immediately." Holmes's eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the boy's face with remarkable speed. He took the note handed to him without a word and read its contents with a speed that was almost unnatural. His lips parted slightly, and I could discern a flicker of something dark, passing through his gaze. "Watson, it seems we have a most peculiar case on our hands. A murder has been committed in broad daylight on Fleet Street," Holmes said, folding the note with an air of precision. "The most troubling part is that the killer appears to have vanished without a trace. We must leave at once." Before I could form a response, Holmes had already grabbed his coat from the stand and was pulling on his deerstalker hat with characteristic efficiency. I knew better than to ask too many questions when Holmes's mind was in such a state. "Come along, Watson. We have work to do." Chapter 2. The Crime Scene. We arrived at Fleet Street with great haste, the cab rattling over cobblestone streets as if it, too, were eager to solve the mystery. The usual din of London was conspicuously absent, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to hang heavily over the crowd of onlookers gathered near the scene of the crime. Policemen stood in a tight ring, their grim expressions betraying the gravity of the situation. Holmes led the way, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with a hunter's precision, taking note of every face, every movement, and every whispered conversation. As we neared the scene, I could see the body of a man lying in the middle of the street. The victim, a young man in his 30s, was dressed in a neatly tailored coat and trousers, his hands folded across his chest as though in repose. But it was the face that caught my attention, pale and twisted in an expression of sheer terror, the victim's wide, unblinking eyes staring up into the void as if frozen in the moment of his death. It was a look I had seen before, but only in those who had been subjected to extreme fear or some unspeakable horror. The body itself gave no further clues. There was no blood, no visible wound, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the man had simply collapsed and died. Holmes moved with purpose toward the body, his footsteps light and measured. He crouched beside the victim, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The position of the body, the angle of the limbs, the faint tremor of a nearby lamppost that swayed in the wind. His gaze swept over the crowd once more, this time with a more focused intensity, as though trying to discern something hidden in plain sight. I stepped forward to examine the body, but Holmes raised a hand, signaling me to wait. He had already noted the same details I had observed, and more. "A most curious case, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and controlled, as though testing the weight of his own words. The victim, Edward Green, a clerk from a nearby law firm, died in the middle of a bustling street, yet there are no signs of any physical injury. No stab wounds, no gunshot wounds, and yet his expression. Holmes's voice trailed off as he examined the face of the deceased more closely. This terror, this unmistakable fear, is unlike any I have encountered before. I don't understand, Holmes, I said, a chill creeping into my voice. If there is no visible cause of death, what are we to make of it? Holmes straightened, his eyes narrowed in thought. The lack of any visible wound suggests that the manner of death is not typical. Whatever killed this man did so without leaving a mark. The question, Watson, is how? I looked to the crowd, the mass of onlookers, all with expressions ranging from curiosity to shock, but none had any answers to offer. Holmes's gaze lingered on them for a moment, then turned back to the body. None of these people witnessed the event, I wager, Holmes said, more to himself than to me. How curious. Someone had to have seen something. Perhaps we shall begin by speaking with the witnesses. Chapter 3. The investigation commences. We spent the next several hours canvassing the area, speaking with anyone who might have witnessed the event. The street was as busy as any other on that particular morning, with people going about their business, seemingly oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded just moments before. A butcher's assistant claimed he had heard a noise, something like a soft thud, but had not thought much of it until he noticed the crowd gathering around the body. An old woman standing outside a bakery had seen the crowd and approached, only to see the dead man lying in the street. But there were no claims of seeing the assailant, nothing to suggest who could have committed such a deed in broad daylight. Holmes, frustrated by the lack of tangible information, grew more pensive by the minute. It was clear that something was amiss, something elusive, and he was determined to uncover it. Returning to our flat in Baker Street, Holmes immediately began poring over the details of the case. His mind raced through possibilities as he shuffled through papers and scribbled notes on the chalkboard, the usual scene of activity that indicated his thinking process was well underway. Watson, he said, pausing mid-thought. The killer's method is most interesting. No wounds, no blood, and yet the victim is dead, terrified beyond reason. I suspect we are dealing with someone who has perfected the art of subtlety, someone capable of orchestrating death without leaving a single trace. I don't understand, I admitted, feeling the weight of the mystery settle heavily on my shoulders. How can anyone kill in such a manner? Holmes turned toward me, his expression sharp and focused. It is not a question of how, Watson. It is a question of what. What did this man encounter that caused him to die of terror? That is the key to unlocking this mystery. Chapter 4. The Arrival of Lestrade. As we continued our investigation, the sound of a carriage outside interrupted our thoughts. A moment later, the door swung open, and Inspector Lestrade entered, his face drawn and weary, his eyes betraying the tension of his work. Holmes, Lestrade said with a weary sigh. We've another case, and I believe it may be connected to the one on Fleet Street. Holmes's attention snapped to Lestrade. Another death? Lestrade nodded grimly. A man named John Hartley, another office clerk, was found dead on Chancery Lane, in the same manner. No injury, no blood, only the terror on his face. It's as if he died of fright. Holmes's gaze intensified, his mind already working through the possibilities. 2 deaths, both with no visible cause. The pattern is clear, Lestrade. We are dealing with a murderer who possesses remarkable skill, a killer who strikes without warning and leaves no trace behind. But who could do such a thing? Lestrade asked, the weight of the case pressing on his shoulders. And why? Holmes turned to the map of London that lay spread out on the table. His finger traced the path from Fleet Street to Chancery Lane, a subtle but deliberate motion. I believe, Holmes said slowly, his voice heavy with contemplation, that we are not merely dealing with a killer, but with someone who is orchestrating these murders in such a way as to leave us with nothing but questions. We must find out who stands to gain from such terror, and who could escape the grasp of the law so effortlessly. Chapter 5. The Chase Begins. The following days were spent investigating every angle of the case. Holmes, as ever, left no stone unturned. He retraced the steps of the victims, spoke to more witnesses, and examined every conceivable location for clues. It was, as always, a race against time. The killer was out there, and each day the trail grew colder. Holmes's thoughts seemed to whirl faster with each passing moment. He began to piece together a theory, one that he shared with me late one evening as we sat in our study, the glow of the fire casting long shadows across the room. Watson, Holmes began, his voice more contemplative than usual, I believe we are dealing with someone whose motive is more psychological than physical. A killer who thrives not on bloodshed, but on fear itself. If I am correct, the answer to this puzzle lies not in what has been done, but in what has been left undone. Chapter 6. The Silent Observer. The next few days saw a marked shift in the nature of our investigation. As I accompanied Holmes to Fleet Street for what seemed like the 100th time, I could feel the intensity in his manner, a razor-sharp focus that had become the hallmark of his genius. There was something in the air that told me Holmes was close, closer than ever, to unraveling the puzzle that had so eluded the police. He had been studying the details of the two murders obsessively. I could see it in the way his eyes flashed when a new detail or theory entered his mind. Still, he refused to share his conclusions with me too early, preferring instead to remain shrouded in mystery until all the facts had been gathered. As we stood at the scene once more, Holmes paused, his hand resting on his chin in that familiar gesture of concentration. He appeared to be studying the cobblestones with an intensity that made the air seem charged with anticipation. I find it odd, Holmes began, turning to me, that no one has come forward with any solid information. In both cases, the victims were murdered in broad daylight, yet no one saw the assailant. How is that possible, Watson? I looked around, observing the bustling street before us, but I could see no answers in the movements of the pedestrians or the errant carriage wheels. Could it be that the killer is using some method of disguise? I suggested, though I knew that Holmes had already considered this angle. Holmes nodded slowly, as though my words had triggered a thought he had been trying to put into words for days. Indeed, Watson, but the timing, the method, it suggests something more subtle. I suspect our killer does not rely on mere disguise, but rather on something that disarms the very act of witnessing a crime. Perhaps our murderer is not observed because he is overlooked. Overlooked? I repeated, perplexed by the notion. Yes. What if, Watson, the killer's presence is so unremarkable that no one notices him? What if he moves in plain sight, blending into the very fabric of the environment? Holmes's eyes gleamed with the fire of a new theory. What if the killer knows how to remain unnoticed, even as he stands among us? Chapter 7. The Mechanism of Fear. Holmes's theory about the killer's ability to remain unseen played on my mind during our return to Baker Street. That night, Holmes withdrew into his study, the silence in the room thick with tension. I knew from experience that when Holmes became absorbed in a case like this, he could go for hours without speaking, lost in the labyrinth of his mind. I, for my part, tried to piece together what little I knew about the victims and their environments. Edward Green, a clerk by all accounts, had been nothing more than an ordinary man. John Hartley, likewise, was said to be a quiet, unassuming character with few friends but many acquaintances. Both men had been well-respected, well-liked, and yet, for reasons that eluded everyone, they had died in broad daylight, frozen by some unseen terror. I decided to do my own digging and, after a few inquiries, found that both men had shared one peculiar trait. They had both recently attended the same social gathering, a lecture on the nature of fear and human psychology. I had been aware that the lecture had taken place at the Academy of Sciences, but I had not considered it a matter of importance until now. Holmes, ever perceptive to the smallest detail, picked up on this thread when I mentioned it to him the following day. "Ah!" Holmes said, rubbing his hands together in that deliberate way he often did when a new lead presented itself. I had wondered if the psychological aspect of the victims' deaths was tied to something more tangible. It seems, Watson, that the key to this entire case may lie within the realm of fear itself. I raised an eyebrow. Fear? How can fear alone explain two seemingly unrelated deaths? Holmes smiled faintly. It cannot, Watson. But the manipulation of fear, the ability to instill terror without touching a soul, that, I believe, is at the heart of our mystery. Chapter 8. The Academy of Science. Our investigation led us to the Academy of Science, where the lecture on fear had taken place. Holmes's reasoning was simple. The victims had both been present at the lecture, and the topics discussed were closely tied to the mind's vulnerabilities. If the killer had knowledge of psychological manipulation, then the murder might have been designed to exploit this knowledge. Upon arriving at the academy, we were greeted by a distinguished gentleman named Professor Archibald Fawcett, who had delivered the lecture on fear. He was a man of moderate height, with silvering hair and a sharp, hawkish nose, his face a study in intellectual rigor. Holmes, ever the master of small talk, quickly got to the heart of the matter. "Professor Fawcett," Holmes began, "I understand you recently gave a lecture on the psychology of fear. Tell me, was there any particular aspect of your lecture that might have been particularly alarming or unsettling for your audience?" Fawcett paused, then smiled faintly, clearly enjoying the intellectual exercise. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, I had not expected to be asked such a direct question. Fear, as you know, is an intensely personal emotion. What terrifies one individual may not even faze another. But if you mean to ask if I deliberately included certain techniques to provoke fear, then I suppose I did mention a few psychological experiments in which people were conditioned to respond to external stimuli with extreme anxiety. It was all in the context of understanding how fear works." "Could such techniques have been used to manipulate someone into a state of terror?" Holmes asked sharply, his voice rising slightly. "Could these ideas have been taken out of context and used to harm?" Fawcett's face darkened. "I would certainly hope not, Mr. Holmes. My lecture was intended to enlighten, not frighten. But I suppose you are implying that someone used this knowledge to instill terror in others." Holmes gave a noncommittal shrug, his eyes narrowing in thought. "It's possible, Professor. You see, we are investigating 2 murders, both of which were committed without physical injury, and the victims were apparently struck dead by fear. I'm wondering if you might have inadvertently provided the tools for such a killer to do his work." The professor seemed shaken, though he quickly composed himself. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I have no knowledge of anyone using my research in such a manner." Holmes studied the professor closely before replying, his voice now a mere whisper. "Perhaps, Professor Fawcett, you should be concerned. We are all connected in ways we do not always understand. The question now is, how many more will fall before this killer is stopped?" Chapter 9, The First Lead. Holmes's visit to the Academy of Science left us with more questions than answers. As we walked back to our flat, Holmes seemed more deeply absorbed in thought than usual, his eyes scanning the bustling street, as though searching for something hidden in plain sight. "It is clear to me now, Watson," he said after a long silence, "that our killer is someone who understands the human mind, perhaps better than most. He knows how to induce fear without laying a finger on his victims. What's more, I believe he is using psychological manipulation, not just as a means of terror, but as a weapon to control his victims." "But how?" I asked. "How can anyone use fear to murder someone without leaving a trace?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a man on the verge of a breakthrough. "Through suggestion, Watson, through the power of suggestion. A victim, when overwhelmed by fear, can be driven to the brink of death, his mind unable to cope with the terror, his body succumbing to shock. That is the method our killer is using." I nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "But how does the killer escape each time? Why does he never leave a trace?" Holmes smiled thinly. "That, Watson, is what we must discover, and I believe we are now on the verge of a breakthrough." Chapter 10, The Vanishing Killer. As the investigation progressed, the elusive killer continued to evade our grasp. We spent days canvassing the city, chasing down leads, and speaking with anyone who might know something about the events surrounding the murders. Yet each step seemed to lead us further down a path that grew colder with each passing day. But Holmes's mind, as always, never wavered. He would pace the room for hours, ruminating over every detail of the case. And then, one morning, as we sat in our Baker Street study, he finally broke the silence. "I believe I have it, Watson," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "I know how our killer is escaping." I leaned forward eagerly, my attention now fully rapt. "How, Holmes?" "Through the use of misdirection, Watson. The killer is not disappearing by any ordinary means. He is using the very crowds of London to hide in plain sight, weaving in and out of them, so that no one notices his presence." "But how does that explain the murders?" I asked, still confused. The key lies in the moment before the victim dies, Holmes explained. At that critical moment, when the victim is most vulnerable, the killer strikes with an unseen hand, perhaps a gesture, a whisper, or a look. The victim's mind, overwhelmed by terror, is unable to react. It is this psychological assault that causes the victim's death. And the killer simply disappears amidst the crowd, I murmured, finally understanding. Exactly, Holmes said. Our murderer is a master of both psychology and stealth. But I believe we are close, Watson. The next step is to uncover who would have the motive and knowledge to commit such a crime. Chapter 11. The Stranger in the Crowd. As the days wore on, Holmes became more and more absorbed in his theory. I could see it in the way he moved, the way he turned his head at the slightest sound, the way his eyes darted across the room, scanning every detail for meaning. He was relentless, as always, and yet there was a new kind of tension about him, something urgent, as though he could feel that the solution was within his grasp, but needed one final push to uncover it. We had spent the previous afternoon observing the streets around the scene of the first murder once again. Holmes had suggested we observe the crowds for anyone who might seem out of place. It was an odd request, considering that the killer was, as Holmes theorized, blending into the crowd. Yet, there was a sense of urgency in his voice that made me follow his instructions without question. Sometimes, Watson, Holmes had remarked as we stood watching the pedestrians, the key to solving a crime is not in what is obvious, but in what is absent. The killer is vanishing, yes, but in a city full of faces, there is a pattern. Someone is slipping between the cracks of society, unnoticed by all. I turned my gaze to the busy street. As the world bustled around us, I couldn't help but feel a chill in the air, as though the very people we were watching might hold the answers we sought. Chapter 12. The Missing Piece. The following morning, a letter arrived at Baker Street. The envelope was unmarked, save for a small, the crimson wax seal that was not immediately recognizable. Holmes opened it with his usual swift, deliberate movements, reading the contents with careful consideration. I watched closely as his expression shifted from one of curiosity to one of grim determination. "Well, Watson," Holmes said, folding the letter neatly. "It seems we've received our next lead." I leaned forward, eager to know more. "What does it say?" Holmes's eyes gleamed, but he said little, instead making his way to the wardrobe where he stored his tools. A moment later, he emerged with his coat and his ever-present magnifying glass. "The killer may not be alone, Watson," he murmured. "Someone else is involved. The letter mentions an arrangement, a meeting at midnight in a dark alley near the East End. It seems our murderer is being watched, or perhaps blackmailed." I looked at him, feeling the weight of this new development settle on me. "You think the killer is working with someone else?" Holmes nodded, his face set. "It is clear now that this is more than just a series of isolated murders. There is a pattern here, one that involves more than just a single perpetrator. This letter suggests that someone else may be pulling the strings, guiding the killer's hand." We set off immediately for the East End, where the letter had specified. As we neared the shadowy, dimly lit streets, the sense of foreboding grew stronger. The alleys felt more oppressive, the atmosphere heavier with each step. Chapter 13. The Midnight Encounter. The clock struck midnight as Holmes and I stood at the edge of a narrow alley near Whitechapel. The dim glow of a nearby lantern flickered, casting long, angular shadows on the cobblestones. Holmes was unusually quiet, his eyes scanning the darkened passage for any sign of movement. "Are you certain this is the place, Holmes?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded without speaking, his hand resting on the pocket of his coat, where his revolver was concealed. The tension in the air was palpable as we waited, our breaths rising in small clouds in the cold night air. Every minute felt like an hour, and the silence between us grew heavier as the moments passed. Just as I was about to speak again, a figure appeared at the far end of the alley, emerging from the darkness. A man in a long, tattered coat moved with a purposeful stride, his head lowered so that his face was obscured in shadow. "This is our man," Holmes whispered. "Stay close, Watson." The figure reached the middle of the alley and stopped. For a moment he appeared to be listening, as if waiting for something. Then, as though prompted by an unseen signal, he turned and began to move away from us. Holmes held up a hand. "Now, Watson, follow him." We moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, careful not to alert the man to our presence. We followed him through the winding streets, down alleyways, and across open courtyards until we reached a decrepit warehouse on the outskirts of the district. The man stopped at the door, knocking 3 times in quick succession. "Stay here," Holmes said, holding me back as the door creaked open. This is where it all comes together. I watched as Holmes vanished inside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. I was left standing alone in the darkened street, the night air thick with tension. Chapter 14. Unveiling the Truth. The minutes dragged on, and my anxiety grew as I waited for Holmes to return. The shadows around me seemed to close in, and I could feel the weight of the case pressing on me. I thought back to everything Holmes had said, the killer's ability to vanish, his deep knowledge of psychology, and the connections between the murders. And now, with this new lead, it felt like we were finally nearing the heart of the mystery. Just as I was beginning to wonder what was taking so long, the door to the warehouse creaked open again, and Holmes stepped into the alley. His expression was unreadable, his eyes sharp with the intensity of someone who had just uncovered a crucial piece of the puzzle. "Well, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "I believe we now know the identity of our murderer." My heart quickened. "Who is it?" Holmes's gaze was steady. "The killer is not alone, Watson. He is being guided by someone of considerable influence, someone with a vested interest in the fear and terror being sown across London. The man we've been following is a messenger, working for a man who is far more dangerous than we first imagined." I raised an eyebrow. "Who is this person?" Holmes hesitated for a moment, his expression darkening. "His name is Dr. Ezekiel Hargrave. He is a psychologist, one with a twisted interest in the human mind. He has been conducting experiments in fear, using it as a tool for control." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "You mean to say that Hargrave is behind the murders?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed, Watson. Hargrave has been using his knowledge to manipulate the killer, instructing him on how to induce fear without leaving any trace. The deaths were never about the victims themselves. They were about creating terror in others, about pushing the boundaries of the human mind." Chapter 15. The final confrontation with Dr. Hargrave's identity revealed, Holmes wasted no time in planning our next move. He was confident that if we could capture the killer, we would be able to extract information about Hargrave's involvement and bring an end to the string of murders. The next night, we set our plan into motion. We knew that Hargrave would be attending a meeting with his accomplice, the very man who had been carrying out the murders. Holmes had arranged for a discreet confrontation in an abandoned warehouse near the docks, an area where Hargrave could be cornered without alerting the public. As we entered the darkened building, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and rusted metal, Holmes's voice echoed through the silence. "Now, Watson," he said, "let us end this nightmare." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man cloaked in a long coat, his face obscured by the darkness. It was the killer. Without hesitation, Holmes sprang forward, his keen instincts guiding him as he grappled with the man. The struggle was brief, but intense, and I could hear the sounds of fists meeting flesh in the silence of the warehouse. With a final swift movement, Holmes had the killer pinned to the ground, his revolver drawn and aimed at the man's chest. "It's over," Holmes said, his voice cold and steady. "You've been caught." The killer's face twisted with fear, his eyes wide as Holmes held him in place. You don't understand," the man gasped. "He's the one who made me do it. Hargrave, he promised me freedom." Holmes's eyes hardened. "Dr. Hargrave," he said, "the true mastermind behind the murders. I knew it all along." Chapter 16. The Doctor's Labyrinth. Dr. Ezekiel Hargrave was apprehended just hours later, as Holmes had anticipated. The full extent of his psychological manipulation was revealed in a manner that chilled me to the bone. Hargrave had been using fear as a tool for experimentation, driven by his twisted desire to control and break the human spirit. It took several days of interrogations, but eventually Hargrave confessed to everything. He had masterminded the murders as part of a larger psychological experiment, seeking to explore the limits of fear and its ability to control a person's mind and body. His accomplice, the killer, had been a former patient, one whom Hargrave had manipulated and turned into a pawn in his cruel games. Epilogue: The Shadow of Fear. With Hargrave's arrest and the killer's identity exposed, the case was closed. But I could not shake the lingering feeling that something darker remained in the city's underbelly. Holmes, as always, moved on to the next mystery, his mind never at rest for long. As for me, I could not forget the faces of the victims, those who had died not by a murderer's blade, but by the power of fear itself. The city was safe, for now, but there were always new mysteries, new threats lurking in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And so, the game continued. The end. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.